The economic and financial sanctions imposed on Russia after its illegal invasion of Ukraine will fundamentally change the international economic system with lasting implications for the way the global economy operates. The sanctions are designed to weaken the Russian government's ability to pursue the war in Ukraine by denying it access to essential global markets for finance, technology, goods, and services. The package adopted so far has three main components: blocking access to financial markets, measures against wealthy individuals who support President Vladimir Putin, and restricting involvement in international markets for goods and services. The search is on to find a way to reduce the Russian government's ability to sustain itself from hydrocarbon revenues, while minimizing the economic cost to European consumers. Economic retaliation against Russia for its aggression in Ukraine could harm vulnerable people around the world and create lasting damage to the global economy if not crafted carefully, just like it is doing now, and its effect is seen everywhere from European countries to the whole world. Welcome to Savvy Economists. Today in this video we are going to be pointing out the several ways sanctions imposed on Russia have affected the global economy as a whole. Before we get into the video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe and leave your notifications on for more updates. Free markets are weakened by sanctions in two ways. First, sanctions like those placed on Russia create severe dysfunction by creating acute supply-side disruptions within free markets. And second, the sanctions spur actors to move away from the common regulatory frameworks and payment systems that underpin global free markets. The supply-side shocks can be seen in surging food and energy prices. Russia and Ukraine account for 14% of world wheat production and 29% of world wheat exports, yet all grain and vegetable shipments from both countries are effectively cut off at present. Wheat futures have risen by around 40% so far this year, reaching their highest levels since 2008. According to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, a shock to prices that causes a drop of a third in real incomes could leave a billion people undernourished. In energy markets, the decisions by the US, the UK, and the European Union to ban, phase out, or significantly reduce oil and gas imports from Russia will send energy prices higher and will significantly affect global price stability, forcing central banks to maintain restrictive monetary policies and derailing the recovery of a global economy still reeling from the effects of the pandemic. Higher prices may also undermine the willingness of consumers in the US and Europe to support sanctions once they begin to perceive direct effects on their pocketbooks. Even more problematic is the fact that as long as energy prices are high and Russia finds a way to still sell its oil, Putin will continue to have the means to fund his military expansionism. This should not be hard. Sanctions busters can render trade restrictions ineffectual. China, the world's largest oil importer, has already vowed not to join the West's sanctions on Russia, and its privately owned refiners have found ways to circumvent banking restrictions in order to continue purchasing oil from Russian producers. Sanctions induce inflation that can seriously harm ordinary people, in effect punishing them for the actions of their rulers. Sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, for example, targeted access and use of foreign exchange, thus stoking runs on the currency, fueling price inflation and deepening humanitarian crises. Exemptions and licenses intended to permit the imports of food and medicine do little to offset the effect of sanctions because of the overall impact on purchasing power and the general toxification of even routine economic activity. Financial actors often refuse to facilitate humanitarian trade and the work of humanitarian agencies. But the Russia sanctions introduce a new dimension of this problem. Given Russia's major role as a commodities exporter, the inflationary impacts of the newly imposed sanctions are not limited to the target country but extend to the global economy and the billions of people whose welfare depends on the reliable operation of free markets. Given these supply-side disruptions, a more significant challenge arises. In their response to the Russia crisis, the US and its European allies have embarked on a set of aggressive measures that target the country's access to global financial markets as well as the Russian government's control over key policy levers. These measures include freezing the Russian central bank's access to its international reserves, dropping various Russian banks from the SWIFT system of international transactions, and impeding investors in ruble-denominated debt instruments from exiting those investments. They also reduce the trust that economic actors around the world have in the functioning of two interrelated systems: the global market for trade in goods and services that allows economies to specialize in doing what they do best, and the global financial system that enables actors to transact within that market. The problem is more serious than it may appear. Russia is not just an isolated case. More than 800 million people live in countries under a U.S. sanctions program or that have a major national-level political group sanctioned, 12% of the population of the developing world. Sanctions are increasingly becoming the norm rather than the exception when Western politicians want to convey that they are taking strong actions to punish violations of international norms. In Friedman's sharp words, the resort to economic sanctions is a confession of impotence, crafted primarily for domestic consumption, to reassure the public. President Joe Biden promised to inflict pain and deal a crushing blow on Vladimir Putin through trade restrictions on commodities like vodka, diamonds, and gasoline in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine 6 months ago. But hundreds of other types of unsanctioned goods worth billions of dollars, including those found on the ship bound for Baltimore from St. Petersburg, Russia, continue to flow into U.S. ports. The Associated Press found more than 3,600 shipments of wood, metals, rubber, and other goods have arrived at U.S. ports from Russia since it began launching missiles and airstrikes into its neighbor in February. That's a significant drop from the same period in 2021 when about 6,000 shipments arrived, but it still adds up to more than $1 billion worth of commerce a month. In reality, no one involved actually expected trade to drag to a halt after the invasion. Banning imports of certain items would likely do more harm to those sectors in the U.S. than in Russia. When we impose sanctions, it could disrupt global trade. So our job is to think about which sanctions deliver the most impact while also allowing global trade to work, Ambassador Jim O'Brien, who heads the State Department's Office of Sanctions Coordination, told the AP. Experts say the global economy is so intertwined that sanctions must be limited in scope to avoid driving up prices in an already unstable market. Also, U.S. sanctions don't exist in a vacuum. Layers of European Union and UK bans result in convoluted trade rules that can be confusing to buyers, sellers, and policymakers. For example, the Biden administration and the EU released separate lists of Russian companies that cannot receive exports, but at least one of those companies which supplies the Russian military with metal to make fighter jets currently dropping bombs in Ukraine is still selling millions of dollars of metal to American and European firms, AP found. Sanctions need to be designed so that their effects are more carefully concentrated on the Russian elite, not ordinary people. Destroying the savings and earnings capacity of millions of Russians should not be an intended consequence of the foreign policy of the U.S. and Europe. The cases of Venezuela and Iran made clear that doing so will simply galvanize animosity towards the West and diminish the ability of Russia's civil society to hold their leaders accountable, as economic anxiety overtakes political activism as people's primary concern. Policymakers must identify vulnerable populations harmed by the second-order economic impacts of the Russia sanctions and help them cope. Russia is home to at least 5.5 million foreigners, for example, most of whom are from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In 2020, these workers sent $17 billion back to their home countries. Countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan receive as much as a third of their GDP in remittances from Russia. While alternative suppliers should be encouraged to increase production and exports, steps must be taken to protect the flow of vital commodities from Russia and Ukraine to the rest of the world, thereby avoiding unsettling markets crucial to global food security. To the extent possible, this should mean convincing the sides of the conflict to protect the ports, roads, and installations crucial to this trade, as well as ensuring that restrictions on international payment systems do not impede transactions related to food and energy. What do you think about the sanctions imposed on Russia? Do you think they are enough incentives to be able to stop the war in Ukraine, or do you think it's completely irrelevant since the global economy still somewhat depends on Russia trades and imports? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn the notifications on. Thank you for watching.